October 23rd, 1942. The calm before the storm. At precisely 8 p.m., the desert exhaled a chilling silence beneath a high, waxing moon. On the western edge of the Alamein front, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, Germany's once invincible desert fox, stood alone in the turret of his command half-track. The cool metal beneath his hands offered no comfort. Gone was the confident, swaggering general of 1941. Months of ceaseless warfare, dysentery, and the oppressive North African sun had left him gaunt, gray, and trembling with fever. A whiff of camphor and medicinal oils clung to him. His staff officers noted it masked the sourness of sweat and sickness. Before him, the 40-mile-long Alamein line stretched from the Mediterranean coast to the impassable Qattara Depression, a final crumbling barrier between the British Eighth Army and the gateway to Egypt. To lose this position would mean retreat, collapse, perhaps even the fall of Cairo and the Suez Canal. Yet Rommel knew the odds were grim. Just 104 battle-weary panzers remained operational, bolstered by exhausted Italian divisions and dwindling fuel supplies. Across the line, General Bernard Montgomery had amassed over 900 tanks, 230,000 men, and total air superiority. The British guns had been silent for days, but the silence was deceptive, ominous. Something was coming. In the flickering glow of a map lamp, Rommel studied the tattered charts of minefields, fuel depots, and tank placements one final time. The plan, Operation Braunschweig, was bold, even desperate. Punch through the British center before Montgomery's massive buildup could be fully unleashed. But deep down, Rommel suspected the window had already closed. They have more fuel, more shells, more tanks. They can afford to lose, he reportedly muttered. Sergeant Fritz Bayerlein, operations officer of the 15th Panzer Division, watched as Rommel gripped the casualty reports with shaking hands. Later that night, he wrote in his diary, "The Herr General smells of camphor and defeat. His gaze was far away. When I handed him the casualty lists, he read them silently, then folded them slowly, like a priest closing a funeral book. The opposing forces, a study in contrasts. By the eve of battle, the disparity between the two sides was stark, almost cruel in its imbalance. On the Axis side, the once proud Panzer Army Africa was a shadow of its former self. Rommel commanded approximately 50,000 German and Italian troops, but barely 27,000 were considered combat effective due to fatigue, sickness, and desert attrition. The armored spearhead, the core of Rommel's desert doctrine, was hollowed out. Only 249 German tanks, many of them outdated Panzer IIIs, whose 50mm guns were no match for newer Allied armor. Supporting them were 192 Italian tanks, primarily M1340s, slow and lightly armored relics that stood little chance in open desert battle. More dire than firepower was logistics. Fuel reserves had dwindled to less than 3 days' worth. Every maneuver, every engine startup was a calculated risk. Facing them, the British Eighth Army under General Bernard Montgomery was an engine of war at full throttle. 195,000 troops, many recently rotated in from the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, were fit, well-fed, and resupplied daily through secure Mediterranean convoys. Their armored might included over 1,000 tanks, featuring the powerful American-supplied Sherman M4s and Grant tanks, whose 75mm guns outranged anything the Axis fielded. Their artillery park boasted over 900 pieces, pre-registered and dug in with mathematical precision. Overhead, the skies were no contest. The Allies flew more than 1,500 sorties a day, dominating reconnaissance, bombing, and close air support. The RAF and Desert Air Force held total air superiority, often attacking Axis columns before they could even reach the front lines. In every measurable category, manpower, armor, air power, fuel, morale, The Eighth Army outmatched the Afrika Korps. Yet the Germans still dug in, fortified their lines, and prepared to hold. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running on fumes. But they had Rommel, and Rommel still had a reputation for miracles. Night attack, 9:40 p.m., October 23rd. As darkness blanketed the desert, the eerie calm shattered under the roar of Allied artillery. At 9:40 p.m., Operation Lightfoot began, Rommel's last gamble to turn the tide at El Alamein. True to his style, Rommel opted for a complex, multi-pronged assault designed not just to pierce the British lines, but to confuse and disorient Montgomery's forces before a decisive armored breakthrough. The plan divided the offensive into three key axes: a diversionary attack against Ruysat Ridge in the north, intended to draw away reserves, a main thrust through Kidney Ridge in the center, where British defenses were thought to be thin, and a bold, almost desperate decapitation strike toward Alam Halfa Ridge in the south, aimed at severing the Eighth Army's command and control infrastructure. It was an audacious blueprint, one befitting the Desert Fox, but one that would demand flawless coordination and fuel the Axis could ill afford to burn. The opening assault saw the 220th Panzer Grenadiers advance into a maelstrom of fire, shielded only by the dim light of flares and the thunder of their own artillery. Combat engineers, or pionniers, crawled into British minefields under relentless fire to carve narrow paths for the armor behind them. Every clearing operation cost men and time the Axis didn't have, as tanks from the 15th Panzer Division rolled forward into what appeared to be open ground. Hidden 6-pounder anti-tank guns of the British 2nd Rifle Brigade opened up with lethal precision. Within minutes, 18 German tanks were blazing wrecks, their silhouettes glowing red through the swirling dust and smoke. One officer, Lance Corporal Hans von Luck, watching helplessly from a forward position, later wrote, "Our lead company disappeared into smoke. Then we heard the terrible sound of brewing up tanks. By midnight, we'd advanced 3 kilometers, but at half strength." The toll was staggering for such a limited gain, but Rommel's orders were clear: press forward, no matter the cost. In the pitch-black desert, confusion reigned. Radio miscommunication, missed rally points, and counter-barrages from the British Eighth Army turned the battlefield into chaos. Montgomery's trap springs shut. By the morning of October 24, 1942, the full extent of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's defensive preparations became horrifyingly clear to the Axis forces. Far from cracking the British line, Rommel's assault had walked directly into a meticulously designed killing ground, a zone of pre-sighted artillery, entrenched armor, and coordinated air support. Montgomery, a meticulous planner, had anticipated the likely Axis routes of attack and transformed the desert into a maze of traps. Sherman and Grant tanks, many with their turrets removed, had been dug in as static bunkers, dubbed moonlight chariots, offering low silhouettes and devastating fields of fire. Around them, interlocking 17-pounder anti-tank guns, organized into formations known as porcupine zones, created overlapping kill lanes that shredded advancing panzers the moment they breached the minefields. The British artillery, refined to near mathematical precision, operated in pre-registered supercharged barrage boxes, zones where batteries could instantly concentrate fire upon radio signal without needing to spot targets visually. These boxes, invisible to the advancing Axis troops, would erupt without warning, engulfing vehicles and infantry alike in coordinated shellfire. At first light, Rommel, weak with illness but still issuing orders, climbed onto the turret of a Panzer command vehicle to survey the field near Kidney Ridge. What he saw was devastation. More than 60 German and Italian tanks lay smoldering, many destroyed overnight, or in futile attempts to breach the British lines at dawn. 1/3 of his armored strength was gone. To make matters worse, Luftwaffe support was minimal, while British and Allied aircraft, operating under complete air superiority, relentlessly strafed and bombed any Axis movement. Deserted open spaces that had once offered maneuver now became death traps under the burning Egyptian sky. Behind the lines, disaster deepened. A critical fuel convoy, intended to resupply Rommel's spearhead units, was ambushed by the British Special Air Service, SAS. The raiders used jeeps mounted with Vickers K guns to destroy dozens of fuel trucks. Without fuel, even Rommel's remaining tanks became little more than steel coffins. Amid this collapse, a grim radio transmission from Captain Wilhelm Bach of the 104th Panzer Grenadiers cut through the static. "We cannot advance. We cannot withdraw. We can only die here." The human cost in the desert furnace. By October 25, 1942, the Second Battle of El Alamein had become more than a clash of armor and strategy. It had descended into a nightmare of suffering beneath the relentless North African sun. Across the battlefield, the human toll began to eclipse any tactical gains. In the rear areas of both armies, makeshift medical stations groaned under the weight of shattered men, and even hardened veterans began to crack under the strain. At a German field hospital near El Daba, medics and surgeons, many themselves dehydrated and running fevers, had been operating without rest for 72 consecutive hours. Supplies dwindled as casualties poured in by the truckload. Morphine ran out before noon, leaving the most grievously wounded with only rags to bite and murmured prayers to endure amputations and burn treatment. With no stretchers left, many soldiers were laid directly on the desert sand, their charred skin blistering further in the midday heat. Worse still was the British tank recovery zone, where units tasked with salvaging wrecks and retrieving bodies faced death from above. German Stukas conducted constant dive-bombing raids, targeting logistics teams and immobilized tanks. Under this rain of iron, crews dug out the remains of fellow soldiers from still smoldering Sherman turrets, often peeling melted steel away with crowbars to reach them. Among the younger reinforcements, barely trained conscripts from Yorkshire and Manchester, many vomited at the sight and smell of what remained inside the blackened hulls of Tommy Cookers, the bitter nickname for British tanks prone to catching fire when hit. The psychological toll deepened by the hour. Sergeant John McGregor of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, writing by torchlight in his field journal, captured the scene in haunting detail. "The flies here feast on living and dead alike. We bury men 1 minute, swat flies from wounds the next. At night, the jackals sing to the wounded. They sound like children crying." Even in victory or tactical gains, there was little cause for celebration. Only silence, exhaustion, and the flickering question in every soldier's mind. Was it worth the price? Why this battle resonates today. The Second Battle of El Alamein endures in global memory not just as a military clash, but as a turning point in human endurance, tactical innovation, and geopolitical consequence. For Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps, it marked the last true opportunity to seize the Suez Canal and potentially shift the entire balance of the war in the Mediterranean and Middle East. Had the Axis broken through, British control over imperial supply lines from India and oil from Iran would have been jeopardized, opening the door to a broader Axis foothold in Africa. Militarily, El Alamein became a blueprint for future conflicts. It was the first large-scale demonstration of modern combined arms warfare, where tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support operated in tightly coordinated roles across a fluid, high-intensity battlefield. Innovations like Montgomery's use of pre-registered artillery barrages, dug-in armor, and integrated deception tactics, Operation Bertram, set a precedent that NATO and Warsaw Pact planners would study for decades. But perhaps what makes El Alamein most relatable today is its human story. For 12 consecutive days and nights, soldiers on both sides endured extreme heat, sleep deprivation, and unimaginable psychological stress. Water was rationed, casualties mounted by the hour, and neither side could retreat without risking collapse. It was a test of willpower as much as firepower. As Winston Churchill later remarked, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." It was not just a battle. It was the moment the tide began to turn.